Hey, good afternoon. I'm Rick Hess, moderating the panel this afternoon. I'm Director of Ed Policy Studies at AEI. Pleasure to be with you guys. We've got with us a, I think, terrific panel looking at a question that, for my money, gets far too little scholarly or disciplined attention in academic circles, which is how do we think about the role of collective bargaining, the opportunities, the challenges. More specifically, the session title is How Teachers Unions Shape District Policy Through Collective Bargaining Agreements. What we've got with us today is three of the people who I think are doing some of the most important and most interesting work addressing these questions. First up, we're going to have Catherine Strunk from USC. Speaking second will be Susan Moore Johnson from Harvard. And third, flying back from Japan to spend 36 hours with us before he goes back to teaching in Kyoto tomorrow, Terry Moe from the Political Science Department at Stanford University. We're then privileged to have with us two phenomenal discussants who can speak to this from firsthand experience in multiple fronts. Up first, we've got Richard Carranza, the superintendent of San Francisco. And speaking second, we have Eric Hines, vice president, just reelected to a second term in the California Teachers Association, a 2-decade CTA member, and a California teacher. The way it's going to work is the presenters will take about 10 minutes each to share their piece. The discussants will then each take about 8 minutes. That'll give us some time to actually have a conversation among this remarkable group. We'll then throw it out to you guys for discussion. I just don't have a lot of use for kind of speechifying from the floor. Everybody in this assemblage gets their turn at the podium speaking about what they actually know. So I'm going to ask that you actually ask questions when you ask questions. If we get 10 or 15 seconds in and I don't see anything in sight, we'll just give somebody else a chance. With that, Catherine, let me turn it over to you.
Hi, so thank you for coming out today. I'm very honored to be on this panel with such esteemed researchers and policymakers. I'm going to talk today about how teachers unions shape district policy through their CBAs. But I wanted to take a step back first and think about how unions shape policy in multiple levels of the district. The first way that I think about them is through collective bargaining units. So as a collective bargaining unit, unions shape district policy by negotiating CBAs, which in turn set school and district policy themselves. And I'll talk a lot about that today. They also work as professional associations. And so my work in LA that I won't get time to talk about much today really highlights how unions can work in conjunction with many partners, including the district, to shape innovative reforms and support teachers in the middle of those reforms. And third, they act as political organizations. And in this way, they influence public and teachers' perceptions of the things that are happening in the district and policy changes. As a result, they influence actions and the makeup of school boards. And in so doing, they can also influence the role and the actions of the superintendent. I'm going to focus today on the collective bargaining agreements, and that's because this is what I study the most. So let me just take a step back about what these CBAs are. I argue that CBAs are themselves policy. And so collective bargaining agreements actually set a good amount of the district policy that dictates how teachers work in the schools and districts, how the schools operate, and these are negotiated by the union in conjunction with their district bargaining partners, usually the school board or the superintendent. There are sort of two theories about the faces of CBAs, what they can do to impact policy. The first is that they provide protections for teachers and they maintain professional working conditions. And if this is what they do, then they're intended to remove the threat of arbitrary, unfair, or biased decisions that can be made by superintendents or principals or other district and school staff. And they can improve working conditions and they can allow teachers who are the experts in their classrooms to have a voice. On the other hand, oftentimes CBAs are seen as policies that can restrict the abilities of administrators and school people to implement necessary policies and reforms that can help improve student achievement. So in this sense, by just having rules and policies, you are in essence removing discretion from administrators. So because they have to abide by what they've negotiated into the contract, they can't always do what they think is maybe best at the time. Some examples of how this occurs is that oftentimes there are rules within the CBAs that require decisions to be based on things other than merit or district needs, such as seniority, and that institute costly and lengthy grievance procedures. Again, these are things that are intended to protect teachers, but at the same time, they also do restrict district administrators' autonomy. If you think that the first side of CBAs is what's going to be prominent here, then you would think that CBAs actually will help to attract and retain high-quality teachers to the teaching profession, and especially to hard-to-staff schools, because you're giving them protections that they can then make them easier to work in these conditions. And in so doing, you might be improving school and district productivity. However, if you think that CBAs have the alternate face, then they might actually dissuade high-quality teachers from the profession, and it actually might reduce efficiency in school and district operations, and in so doing, harm student achievement. I think this is an open question. I don't think that there's been a lot of research, and some of the panelists here have done a lot of it, about what we actually see happening in these CBAs. And so this is where my research is focused. And what I've done is I've looked at 500 collective bargaining agreements across the state of California in the 2005-06 school year, the 2008-09 school year, and I'm currently looking at them in the 2011-12 school year. And I've tried to understand the level of restrictiveness of each of the provisions within these contracts, so what's in them, and then how much do they actually restrict district administrator autonomy, and how much do they actually protect teachers and their rights. And I've tried to rank them kind of on a continuum, and together with Sean Reardon, we've generated a measure that we think is a very objective, statistically based measure of contract restrictiveness to district administrators or protection to teachers. So I'll talk about that work today. The first thing that I thought was interesting when I started doing this research was that the policies in CBAs are not uniform. So you would often think that there's kind of a scripted CBA and then everyone has the same thing, but that's actually not the case. So I see a lot of variation across district policies that are in the CBAs across districts and over time. So between the 2005-06 and the 8-9 school year, we see actually quite important and interesting changes happening within the same district over the two different sets of negotiation cycles. Why this is important is because it means that these are not static documents. They don't just dictate policy once and then forever stay the same. There are actually clearly things happening in these districts that are causing policies to change. On average, I see that the CBAs are getting slightly more restricted to district administrators over the course of these two negotiation cycles. But the CBAs do include both provisions that both restrict administrators but also protect teachers and also enhance teachers' working conditions. What I found is that the districts that are the hardest to staff, and by that I mean the ones that have the highest proportion of minority and the lowest income students, oftentimes have the most restrictive provisions. So for an example, they require that evaluations be announced far ahead of time, and they require that you can only observe a teacher for a certain amount of time, once in an observation cycle every other year. These things sort of restrict district administrators' autonomy to do what they might feel is best, and those are the kinds of provisions that are oftentimes more likely to be in these hard-to-staff districts' contracts. However, these same districts have provisions that that enhance the teacher's working conditions. So for instance, these are the same districts that have leave policies that allow teachers to take longer leave for childbearing, or for child rearing, or for emergency leave or sick leave. And these are important things that will help teachers to find the teaching conditions easier to teach in. I do find that urban and larger districts overall have more restrictive contracts in both sets of years. I do also see that these are things that we should care about. And so in a cross-section, this is just the 2005-06 set of contracts, I find that districts with stronger CBAs do spend their money differently, but not in the ways you would expect. So they have higher overall spending when they have stronger collective bargaining agreements. But this is not driven by higher teacher salaries. This is actually driven by higher administrator salaries and by higher spending on instruction-related expenses. We also see that contract strength is associated with lower student achievement in one single year, measured in multiple ways, not only in API, which as you all know in California is kind of a conglomerate, a measure of student achievement, but also in lower graduation rates, lower proficiency rates, and a greater likelihood that districts will be in program improvement under NCLB. This is especially the case in schools and districts that have higher proportions of minority students and lower income students. I want to stress that I don't think causality is clear here. So there could be two theories. The first is that you negotiate in a stronger collective bargaining agreement, it does create inefficiency, which then lowers student achievement. But the flip side is that these are harder to staff districts when you have more low-income students and more low-achieving students, and you may be negotiating in stronger contract provisions to protect teachers in those areas and to give them better working conditions. The work I'm doing now, looking at the contracts over time, hopefully will help me figure out which of these causal directions is the case. I want to quickly talk about some of the work I've done with Jason Grissom, who's in the audience from Vanderbilt University, looking at whether or not you can connect the political power of unions to the collective bargaining agreements and the kinds of policies that are in them. And the question really is, does the political power of unions shape the policies that are involved in that are included in the CBAs? So is there a causal arrow in this direction? Jason and I showed that yes, it does. So districts with stronger unions, and we define union strength in this sense, are more powerful unions, as a school board survey, in a school board survey in California, the school board members ranking or discussion of how strong teachers unions are and their power, as well as what they do to help them in elections relative to other interest groups, so relative to community groups or business groups. So we find that more powerful unions do negotiate stronger contracts overall, And it's especially the case in unions that assist board members with fundraising and voter mobilization. So these kinds of powerful unions do have stronger collective bargaining agreements with the kinds of policies, especially in evaluations, transfers and vacancies, and working conditions that may restrict district administrators more. So I didn't get a chance to talk about my work in LA today, which is much more looking at the professional associations of unions and the role that they play in that. But I want to stress that as we move forward as researchers, as Rick said, this is a very under-researched topic, and we all know is a very important topic. We need to think about how these three ways that unions can shape district policy work together. So what we see in LA is that unions take on all three roles, and they affect district policy by working in all three of these ways together to shape district reform, oftentimes in innovative ways and oftentimes in ways that may stifle their reforms. And it's important to think about how these unions work with all three of these levers as we move forward, and I think that the panel will talk to that to some extent today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
That was good.
Is that all right?
That was good and interesting. It's such a refreshing break. I like it.
Oh dear. So, Catherine, I'm going forward and it's going. Can you help me? Oh, they're going to do it. Okay. Oh, don't start that clock yet.
You got it.
I'm really pleased to be here today. I want to say before I start that I have to get to a plane in order to teach my last class tomorrow, and not only do I have to get through security, I have to get out of this building. So when I leave, please forgive me, I'm not fleeing the conversation. I want to really take a different direction, as you'll hear, and talk more about some of the unusual policies or notable policies that have come out of collective bargaining. Following the publication of A Nation Prepared in 1985 and its call for a profession of well-educated teachers prepared to assume new powers and responsibilities to redesign schools for the future, I wrote an article asking, can schools be reformed at the bargaining table? Now, it's hard to believe, but 25 years later, I'm still trying to make sense of that question. I've never really left it, and the answer is yes, they can. But collective bargaining does not always yield reform, and in fact, the outcomes of the process can actually block important reforms. As Catherine suggested in talking about the two faces of the CBAs and echoing Freeman and Medoff's idea of the two faces of unionism, the collective bargaining can be a source of possibility or paralysis. And we can all cite examples of each. My interest in teachers' unions and in collective bargaining has always been motivated by my belief, really, I think it's my certainty, my conviction, that reforms that address teaching, learning, and teachers are immeasurably improved if they're informed and guided by teachers, rather than if teachers are ignored or excluded from the process. And further, and I think this is very clear as we look at the implementation of reforms today, in order for complicated reforms to be effectively implemented, teachers have to be genuinely engaged in the process. And that's something different than the superficial buy-in that is signaled by the absence of objection to a particular policy. So currently, from my view, collective bargaining is the only formal legal process that ensures teachers a meaningful role in creating and tailoring policies. This is not just for their self-protection, and I understand that plays a role, but actually for building good policies. In states and districts that require at best consultation, many policies are adopted without the kind of guidance that teachers can provide and may not have the support required for implementing them. I've always found broad generalizations about what collective bargaining or unions do or don't do less helpful than looking very closely at really what happens in the local district, because ultimately collective bargaining is a local matter and contracts are local creations. And so that's what I want to focus on a bit today. We're at a very important moment in many regards, but on this in particular, when some states are aggressively restricting the scope of bargaining for teachers, and thus, I would argue, the influence that teachers can have, at the same time that labor and management in other districts and states are actually developing some remarkable reforms. And I want to point briefly to three what I would regard as groundbreaking reforms, each of which answers at least one of the following three seemingly intractable problems that are often blamed on unions. One is a standardized salary scale, which, by the way, was never introduced through bargaining, preceded it by many years. Two, the difficulty of firing incompetent tenured teachers. And three, the difficulty of holding teachers accountable for students' learning. So the first one, I'm going to just kind of put these up and give you a brief look at them. They're all available online if you want to learn more. The Baltimore Pathways program was a career-based pay system that totally replaced the single salary scale. And most people are not even aware that this has happened. That scale is gone. They introduced a new currency called academic units, which allows teachers to move up levels within these pathways. They can earn higher pay within the system, and they move based on evaluations, professional development, and their contributions to student learning, to their colleagues and to the district. The plan has 4 pathways. The top 2, the model and the lead, include a peer review process that reviews teachers who apply for entry. And if the teachers are on the model or lead pathway, they can hold roles of leadership from their classroom as well as at the school level. It's jointly governed by 2 labor management panels, one a kind of senior panel, but the most interesting one is one that includes 8 teachers, 4 district appointed, 4 union appointed, and they are employed full time for the past 3 years now to implement this contract agreement, to kind of make it work, move people to the pathways, figure out how the assessments are done. The teachers are going to vote this spring about whether to continue with this, and the signs are positive. The president of the union is unopposed, and so people are taking that to be a signal that her effort to collaborate was in the end okay. The second one is a peer assistance and review programs, which are better known, have been around since the early 1980s in Toledo. Basically, this is an arrangement whereby consulting teachers who are expert teachers, competitively selected, intensively assist and eventually evaluate all novice teachers. This is the typical plan, and selected tenured teachers who are identified as struggling. So there's a lot of support, a lot of familiarity about the frameworks, the rubrics and all, and then the consulting teacher submits an evaluation to a joint labor management par panel that oversees the program. The consulting teachers report on the performance of teachers to the panel. The panel recommends action to the superintendent, and the process assures due process, so if people are dismissed, there's not a long trail of arbitrations and court cases, and it has been shown to increase in all districts, both retention of the beginning teachers especially, and to increase dismissal rates, which is pretty interesting. The third, The third is the TVAL in New Haven, adopted in 2009-2010 negotiations. I know that you can't see the details on this, but what I want you to see is the color blocks. Basically, this is a system by which a teacher's evaluation includes 3 components: student performance goals, which includes state standardized test performance when it's available, classroom observations by administrators, and assessments of teachers' professional values as rated by administrators. So across the top are the student growth scores of 1 through 5. On the left are the combined score, 80% observation, 20% professional values. And for each teacher, you get 2 ratings and you see where you fall on this. What's notable about this is teachers who fall in the ones, which is the bright yellow for those of you who can at least see the colors, and for the people who receive fives, those are the blue. If it's clear that people are on the track to getting those evaluation scores in November, another evaluator is brought in as another observer of the class. And so they kind of intensify the observation for people who are either at risk of dismissal or have the possibility of earning more money, having broader responsibility. 34 teachers left the district because of performance in year one, which is way more than had ever happened before, demonstrating that dismissal is possible. This is fascinating. It's really, we're going to watch this for some time. Morgan Donaldson, who's I think in the audience today, is doing research on this, and it's just very important that we understand how this happened. No time to talk today about the bargaining process that was involved in them, but let me just say simply that these were collaboratively bargained. So if reform is achieved across the bargaining table, it's usually not a table with two sides. It's actually an elaborate process of work groups and task forces and ongoing implementation. Adversarial approaches to negotiation usually do not do very well at solving problems. Some would say that these programs are rare birds, that we should treat them as unusual exceptions, not the norm. And certainly they're not typical of all agreements, thousands are much more prosaic and sometimes problematic. But I'm convinced that these reforms, because they've been so carefully built and developed and explored, are not going to disappear suddenly. And currently they're serving as the models for other districts. At the same time, I have not seen other districts that do not bargain, where teachers have comparable influence or where comparable reforms have been implemented. I'm sure there are, and I'm sure I'll hear about them after this. But for that reason, I think we have to take very seriously the possibility of collective bargaining, invest in the process as an effective approach, potentially effective approach, to developing and implementing reforms. My last slide is a slide with websites, links to our website at the Project on the Next Generation of Teachers. The bottom one is the User's Guide to Peer Assistance and Review that reports on the 7 districts that we studied doing this, and that has a lot of practical information that may be of use. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Susan. Terry, it's all you.
All right. I just flew in from Japan only to be on this panel because I think this panel is a really important event for the education research community. I wanted to be a part of it. By any measure, the teachers' unions are absolutely central to American education, to its politics, to its reform, to the way schools are organized. And this has been true for 30 years, ever since the unions came to power in the 60s and 70s. And yet, throughout this entire time, they've rarely been studied. So my first theme here is we have to do something about this. We need to create a serious, sustained social science literature on the unions to understand their role in American education and its consequences. So, how do we do that? Well, my second theme is we can't just think that what it involves is amassing evidence. That's part of it. But the point of social science is to explain. It's to understand. And in social science, we do that through theory. So in a productive literature, what we have is an interplay of theory and research, where research is theoretically guided, theories are evaluated with reference to evidence, there are alternative theories, and we move over time to theories that are better and better at explaining the way this portion of the world works. So yeah, we need empirical research that amasses evidence, but theory has to be at the heart of the whole enterprise. So that's what I've tried to do in my own work. I'm a political scientist. I've been studying government for over 30 years, and the way I approach unions in schools theoretically is exactly the same as the way I approach Congress or the bureaucracy or the presidency or political institutions generally. My focus is on the interests of the players and their powers and how these things work themselves out within institutional contexts. And this is pretty standard, within political science, and schools are part of government. They're no different, and my approach is no different. So, what are the interests of the teachers' unions that primarily drive their behavior? Well, I think the best way to understand their behavior is to view them as organizations that protect and promote the job interests of their members. This is a very simple theoretical approach, but I think it's analytically very powerful, and I think it's consistent with most of the evidence out there. Not all, but most. And this simple theoretical approach leads immediately to a very important, big implication, which is that as the unions use their power in promoting job interests, they will do things that undermine the effective organization of schools. They don't do it on purpose. That is not their intention. But it happens because job interests and effective organization are not the same. They come into conflict. And when they do, the unions promote job interests, and this creates problems. And this is unavoidable. So, consider seniority-based layoffs. The unions obviously are staunch supporters of these rules. But in practice, what these rules lead to is, in layoff situations, fantastic young teachers get laid off. And there are terrible teachers in the classroom who happen to have seniority, and they get kept on. Right? This is not a formula for effective organization, obviously. And Boyd and colleagues have shown in empirical research that when these rules are followed, the result is a less effective teaching force. Now, these kinds of rules are just the tip of the iceberg, because labor contracts are filled with restrictive work rules that were adopted for job reasons and for reasons that have nothing to do with effective organization. So it's not a surprise that sometimes they're going to come into conflict with effective organization. Now, Catherine and I have both done research on restrictive work rules, and my own work has been on seniority-based transfers. I have a couple papers on that. I have an article on the impact of restrictiveness of contracts in general on student achievement, which is negative. Catherine has just described her own research. The bottom line is that these rules do sometimes lead to organizational problems and to lower performance. All right, so it's not a surprise that districts want to reform the contract to make schools more effective. But the problem is unions support these rules, and they support those rules not because of their impact on effective organization, but because of jobs. There's a conflict there. And so what you have to expect is that as districts try to move toward effective organization, they will meet resistance. This is just a reality. Okay, so the same is true for other kinds of reforms. I mean, take performance-based evaluations. If we had a serious, rigorous program of performance-based evaluations for teachers, the fact is a lot more teachers would be found to be unsatisfactory, and a lot more teachers would be dismissed. Well, the unions don't want this. They've never wanted this. It conflicts with their job interests. And so for 30 years, they've been resisting it. So it's not surprising that here we are in 2013, and the most obvious reform in the world, hey, maybe we should evaluate teachers based on performance, seems like a new thing. Well, it's been resisted for 30 years successfully. Okay, so here we are, and it looks like it's moving forward. What's happening? Well, I think what a lot of people would say is, well, the unions are on board now. You know, they support this. And what I would say is their interests are the same. You know, what's changed is their environment. The environment for them is bad, right? In the last 5 years, things have happened. There's the fiscal crisis. A number of important Democrats have stood up and recognized that the unions are obstacles to reform. They are increasingly politically isolated. And as a result, they've had to make a lot of concessions, right? But it's important to see them, except there are exceptions, and we can talk about that. But it's important to see most of these things as concessions and not as unions support, genuine support for a thorough program of teacher evaluations, right? They're only going to go as far as they have to, and that's what collaboration is going to yield. Ultimately, it will yield, I think, half a loaf, weak reforms, because as the unions participate in collaboration, collaboration is just another forum for exercising power in their job interests. And so that's going to create more problems for districts as they try to create truly effective organizations. All right, so now let me shift to another level. I can't just keep talking about reforms. I don't have enough time. So this other level is elections. Right? Through elections, unions can, if they can exercise power in elections, shape who sits on school boards. And therefore, they can determine who the authorities are within the district that govern collective bargaining, make policy, and so on. If they can be powerful in elections, they can get their friends and allies elected to school boards. Right? And my own research shows that they're very successful at doing that. Right? They're very organized, they're very active, and more than other groups, they're able to get sympathizers on the board. Okay, well, this changes things, right? We can't just think of districts as being the reformers and they're pushing for effective organization, because in many cases, they're not. You know, in many cases, they're very sympathetic to what the unions want because they're dependent on the unions electorally, or they're afraid of the unions electorally. All right, so what I would say is all this stuff just needs to be researched. You know, it shouldn't be the case that I and a few other people are doing research on this. We're going to have a lot of people doing research on this and trying to put together the big picture of the real role that the unions play in American elections and in collective bargaining and in the formation of policies like performance-based evaluations. Okay, so now let me talk about the question at hand very quickly, since my time is running out. What do we do? I mean, what's the role of teachers' unions in district reform? Well, our society faces a dilemma. Teachers should be involved in reform. They're the experts. But because unions have power, they'll use that power to protect jobs. And that will bring them into conflict with effective organization. And so I think the result will be that through collaboration, which sounds like a good thing, the unions will use their power to limit and weaken reforms, and what we'll get in the end, long term, is half a loaf that will ultimately be very disappointing. So, one final point, if it's okay with Rick. And the final point is that I didn't come here from Japan to convince you that I'm right, because I think that's impossible. So I am here to try to argue that we need a lot more people studying the teachers' unions. We need to have a big, dynamic literature on this topic. It's important enough to justify that. Theories need to be at the heart of that literature. And the theory that I've proposed, if people disagree with it, fine. Then they should propose alternative theories. They should bring evidence to bear that shows why mine is wrong and why theirs is right. We should have theoretical debates, and we should move over time toward better and better theories that explain the union's role in education and its consequences. That's what a productive literature is all about, and that's what I'm really arguing for. So, thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Richard.
Good afternoon. I guess I'm the practical. We're the practical end of the table. How does this actually work? Quisiera empezar para decirles que el propósito de las uniones en las escuelas es un asunto de sumamente importancia a nuestra nación, a nuestro sistema educativo. Espero que lo que les voy a enseñar, lo que les voy a platicar, sea de importancia para ustedes también, especialmente a los que están desarrollando la póliza de los Estados Unidos. Quick show of hands, how many of you understood exactly what I just said? Beautiful. How many of you did not? Welcome to my experience as a kindergartner in the public school system. You see, I'm an English language learner. I only spoke Spanish when I started kindergarten. Now, why do I choose an irreverent way to start my remarks with you? Because it's going to give you context, and perhaps it will shape what you expect me to say as a superintendent about this topic. And the point that I want to make that's going to be the umbrella point of all that I'm going to talk about is basically this. We refuse to accept the prospect that teachers are broken. You can't start from that notion. Teachers are broken. You got to fix them or fire them. Because if it wasn't for the teachers that I had that taught me English, that didn't give up on me, that said, not only will you become a good student, I'm going to make sure you become a good student. You're going to go to college, even though your father didn't go to college, even though your mother didn't go to college. How do you evaluate that? Show me the data that gives you evaluation data on that. So I'm going to start from a very practical position, which is we don't always have the ability or the time to start from a proposition that people are broken. So with that, I will say that I think in San Francisco, we by no means join hands and sing Kumbaya every single day. But we've had an eHarmony moment. And the eHarmony moment is, what do we both agree on? The district and the union. What do we agree on? What is it that we both want to commit to? And then let's work really hard at getting to that. And what we've said is that we want to get to the point where every student is successful in San Francisco. And we've already agreed to disagree on how we're going to get there sometimes. But let me share some statistics with you on why this is so important. In San Francisco, this beautiful city by the bay, that it's very progressive, that has very forward-thinking liberal policies. 80% of the residents of San Francisco do not have school-age children. Marinate in that for a second. 80% do not have school-age children. Of the 20% that do, 30% of them send them to private or parochial schools. So who are the children in the public schools of San Francisco? And when you look at the children in the public schools of San Francisco, if you're an African-American student, you're 8 times more likely to be identified as a student with special needs, special ed, emotionally disturbed. If you're a Latino student or a Pacific Islander, you're 4 times more likely to go to jail or prison than to graduate from high school. That should hit us all across the forehead. So if those are the organizing concepts of this eHarmony moment, then what are we going to do about it? And that really forms the conversations that we've had with our teachers union here in San Francisco. And we push each other, and we get behind closed doors sometimes, and we're not so nice to each other. But we've agreed that we're not going to be disagreeable in public because it doesn't help the public discourse. There's enough people taking whacks at public education. We're the piñata of public education, right? Everybody's lining up and taking a whack. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've done. In San Francisco, we came together and we said, what we're going to do is we understand that if teachers aren't broken, then what we need to be able to do is create a system where teachers have professional development, where we develop skill sets in the pedagogy so that we're able to address the needs around the statistics that I just described for you. So how are we going to disrupt and accelerate the learning for students that have not historically been served well in our system? So what we did is we put a ballot initiative on the ballot, Prop A, and it was a parcel tax in San Francisco. And what we agreed to, and we negotiated this collectively, we collectively bargained this before we ever went and put it on the ballot. But we said that there would be 4 prongs to this initiative. Number 1, that we would provide funding. This initiative would provide funding for professional development, targeted professional development for teachers and for paraprofessionals. So everybody would get an allocation. We also said that we would provide hard-to-staff stipends for certain grade levels and certain subject areas in certain schools. Because we know that because of the way demographics work in our city, there are some schools that have no problems hiring. There are other schools that, because of the challenges, have difficulty in hiring. So we're going to provide hard-to-staff stipends. We also said that we were going to fund some incentives. Now, you could call it performance incentives. What we decided to say is, no, everybody's working hard. We just want people to work smart. So what we are incentivizing is innovation. So what are the schools that are actually reducing this achievement gap? And by the way, the statistics that I shared, we call that the achievement gap. It exists in our school system. I'm sure if you look in your school system, it probably exists there too. What are the schools and what are those strategies that are working well in San Francisco that are really addressing the achievement gap? And then we're going to give you some funding, not only to deepen that work in your school, but then we're going to ask you to be the coaches for others that are similarly situated so that they can learn from what you're doing. Because we truly believe that. Remember, teachers aren't the problem. And then the third thing is we doubled down on PAR, peer assistance and review. And I will tell you that when we started this whole process, we have a process where the union, the teachers union sits on the PAR panel, the administrators union sits on the PAR panel, the central office types sit on the PAR panel, and we have dismissed teachers. But it's not before we've engaged in a rigorous coaching and a rigorous analysis of the pedagogy, side-by-side coaching, lots of feedback, very clear expectations. And we're also very proud of the fact that we've actually seen teachers that have been very successful going through the PAR process as well. So we do have some examples of how this works well. The last thing I'll say before, because I want to talk about some of these positive things, is San Francisco had 10 schools that were identified for school improvement grants. And if you remember the school improvement grant process, the turnaround model, you have to reconstitute 50% of your teaching staff. Remember that? So what we said is, and it's already done, so sorry, Secretary Duncan. What we said is, we're not going to reconstitute 50% of our staff right off the bat. So what we did is, instead of getting into a battle with our teachers union, we sat down, we said, okay, how are we going to be smart about this? What we did is we developed a job description. If you want to be in one of these 6 schools, it's going to be a different kind of working environment. There's going to be longer hours. There's going to be additional professional development. There may be 2 weeks in the summer. We just listed it out. And then what we did is we sat with every teacher in the schools, and the principal and an HR person had a conversation with the teachers. Hey, look, this is what it's going to look like. Do you want to stay? If you don't, no harm, no foul. Some people had sick parents. Some were new parents that had young children. Some folks were finishing master's degrees and doctorates. They just couldn't do the time. No problem. We gave them opportunities to go first choice to other schools' vacancies in the district. I will tell you, at the end of that process, it was not contentious. You didn't read about it in the news. But every school got to the 50% or more. And the schools that stayed, the teachers that stayed in those schools, I will tell you, had some of the best outcomes for students over the 3 years. In some cases, 6 times the rate of acceleration as compared to other schools in the district. Now, that created some other problems that Mr. Moe, that professor, has talked about, because when it came time to do layoffs, some of these teachers in these schools that stayed and had the greatest increases in student achievement were some of our youngest tenure teachers. And that created another policy discussion, which when we have more time, we'll get into as well. So thanks for being here.
Good morning. My name is Eric Hines, and I am the union. and I want to talk a little bit about what that means. I mean, when we talk about the union, we're not talking about some smoke-filled room with a couple of guys with cigars. I don't smoke cigars. And what we're talking about is the kindergarten teacher down the street, or a middle school English teacher in Fresno or Hanford or places like that, or we're talking about a high school biology teacher in Los Angeles. That's who we're talking about when we talk about the union, bus drivers and secretaries and paraprofessionals and all. That's when we talk. I'm not talking about a separate entity. We're actually talking about the professionals who are working in the schools with the children. And so I want to talk a little bit about my union, which is the California Teachers Association. We turn 150 on May 9th. That's in just a few days. And in that 150 years, we were formed by the fourth superintendent, John Sweat of California, in order to fight for free and public education for all the students in California, and that's not just the white kids, but also the black and brown kids in California. And since then, we're still fighting that fight. I think we need to ask when we're having this discussion about school reform and what the union's role in that is. What do we mean by reform? Because what I've heard so far, school reform meaning is, does it mean less restrictive or more restrictive? The balance of power. Does it really belong with the administrator, giving them discretion, or does it belong with the teachers with restrictive collective bargaining units? Is it about just firing more teachers so we can get more of those bad teachers out of the room because we're just not doing enough? And how does seniority play in a role like that? Is that really what reform is about? And I think if that's what we're talking about when we talk about reform, we're really missing the entire conversation, and we're missing the forest for the trees. Because really what school reform and transformation should be about raising student achievement, about closing the achievement gap, about improving teacher instructional practice. And I know that's what my union's about. And let me just give a few examples about how that works. One great program, which has been around for now about 7 years, is called the Quality Education Investment Act. About 7 years ago, CTA sued Governor Schwarzenegger at the time for money that was owed to the schools under Proposition 98, which is California's minimum school funding guarantee. We won about $3 billion in that lawsuit, which sounds like a lot of money, but in California, if you spread that out, it's only about $2 or $3 per student. And instead, the union took a lead and decided to create a program that would focus on some of the lowest performing schools in California. 500 of the decile 1 and 2 schools is rated by they were identified by their districts, rated under the Academic Performance Index, which is California's rating scale, and focused the money on those schools. So it would even bypass the district, and the money went locally to the schools. They were freed up from some of their other categorical restrictions. The money was used to lower class sizes. It was used to bring some more counselors to the school. And then the school community, through their school site councils, got to decide what to do, what they needed to do in order to raise student achievement. We have an external evaluator, Vital Research, which has been looking at the results of this work. And what we're finding out, it probably comes to no surprise to the teachers in the room, that these schools are beginning to outperform like schools who didn't have the extra resources and the control. Not only are they outperforming them on the API scores, on there's California standardized testing scores and all that. I mean, that'd be great enough, but even that's too limiting. What we're finding out is their school climates have improved. They have a higher level. Their morale at the schools has improved. The reputations of the schools and the communities have improved. In fact, some districts were complaining that now teachers want to go into those schools rather than try and get out of those schools. And we also are seeing greater parent involvement in those schools. Another area is teacher evaluation, which CTA has worked very deeply in. And we have developed a teacher evaluation framework, which again moves away from the idea that the purpose of a teacher evaluation is to get the bad teacher and kind of like a gotcha. Because I think if that's really what you do, then you're missing the whole point of the evaluation. What we believe as a union is that teacher evaluation should really focus on improving teacher instructional practices and thereby improving student achievement. We focused on things away from there's the substantive piece of the evaluation, which has to do with the high stakes decision making, whether they reach permanent status or whether they keep their jobs and those kinds of things. But really the focus of the evaluation is more on the formative side of the evaluation, which talks about teacher collaboration, working together in school communities through developing and building a social capital at that school, which some of the research indicates that the Andy Hargraves is doing, and Dennis Shirley is doing, and Fuller is doing, around that actually raises individual teacher practice. That's what we think the problem is with, or that the focus should be of the teacher evaluation. What we see then is also what we need to do is be supporting the struggling teachers so that we can improve their instructional practice and move them into programs like the PAR program, which is in California and focusing on giving them. And if they don't improve and they continue to struggle, yeah, there should be some teachers that should be counseled out of the profession. That would be natural, and we should tie them to things like the California standards for the teaching profession and other things like that. We're also continuing to have the discussion around teacher credentialing and who we allow in the profession, and how do we prepare teachers, and that there should be a stronger link between higher ed teacher education programs and the K-12 system that they're being prepared for, and there should be stronger ties between those and the field practice of beginning teachers. Who do we, again, let in the profession? How do we credential them? And then how do we support them, not just in their first couple of years and then allow them to go off kind of on their own, but until they reach that kind of sweet spot of teaching. And some of the research indicates that they don't reach that until about their 5th to 8th year of teaching. And then what are their options? Is it just staying in the classroom? How do they become teacher leaders? Maybe some may go into administration. Some may want to go into teacher leadership positions that are non-administrative. And there are lots of different mentoring other new teachers or supporting new teachers. There's all kinds of areas that unions have interest to that, yes, it's also a part of making sure there is fairness and protection in the system, but it's really about raising student achievement and student practice. And I have a whole bunch of other examples I'm not going to talk about, but I'm willing to answer. But when we talk about things like the TRUIMs, the interest of the teachers union, those are the interests of my union, because that's the way it's happening. And I'll stop there for now.
Yeah. I'd like to thank all you guys for being actually pithy and concise and sharp. It's awesome. One thing that I'd like to do is it seems to me when we have these kinds of conversations in different settings, in different rooms, it's easy to talk past each other. So one thing I'd like us to do is just try to put back on the table some of the different things that were said, and just I think at least I'd be interested, and hopefully the audience will be interested in just hearing you guys identify exactly where we're disagreeing and where we're not. So let me just, one thing on the table is, Eric just referred to it. Terry put out very frankly what he, the argument that motivates his book Special Interest, which is that the interests of, interests of the unions are there to represent the interests of their members, and that the job interests of teachers are not always the same as the interest of effective organizations. Susan, I mean, you were pointing to some examples where you put, but I'm curious with that premise, how much of that you agree or disagree with?
Well, I think it's I think that teachers' interests and unions' interests in many cases, not all cases, are broader than that. That it's job protection is one of many factors that are of concern to unions, and I think particularly with the new generation of teachers who are entering the classroom, they have other places to go. Job protection is not at number one for many of them. They want to work in schools where they can succeed. And so workplace interests that allow people to work in environments that support learning, that are orderly, that are well managed and led, where colleagues are able to work together, where time is well used. Those are a broader set of workplace interests, and I think, I mean, I've been studying unions since the late 1970s, and I have seen this elaboration of the concerns of teachers being reflected in the kinds of initiatives of unions. So I think it's just very helpful to expand this idea of what the interests of the current teacher unions are.
Jerry?
Yeah.
Well, look, I think it's always possible to look at any situation and say, well, it's complicated. Unions are very different, one from another and across the country, and you can't really generalize. And, I think that this is really not what social science is about. I mean, when I talk about job interests being absolutely central to what unions do, I'm not saying that every single union everywhere does this all the time. Right? What I'm saying is this is the central tendency, and if we're going to start somewhere, I think that's at the heart of it. And I think it is at the heart of a lot of the problems that have plagued the education system and the union's role within it. So, are there exceptions? Yeah, there are exceptions. You know, I think I've been sort of amazed at what's been happening in New Haven. You know, I think that the union there has really played an active, positive role in developing their teacher evaluation system. You know, but there are 14,000 districts in this country. You know, and I think if you point to New Haven and think, yeah, you know, every union can be like that. Good luck with that, right? I don't think so. Now, maybe I'm wrong, right? But I think that this is happening in New Haven. It might happen in a few other places, but the central tendency is it doesn't happen. Now, peer review. This is an interesting situation. I like peer review. I think basically, you know, teachers are the best judges of what good teaching looks like. And ideally, it would be great to have teachers evaluating other teachers, right? The problem is teachers don't like this, right? There are some districts like Toledo that have peer review systems. And, you know, there are a number of districts across the country that do, but the vast majority of districts don't. And the vast majority of unions don't want to do this. And the reason is teachers don't want their unions to be involved in evaluating them and dismissing them. Teachers want their unions to protect their jobs, right? So this is just a reflection of this central tendency that's at the heart of it.
Okay, so actually, Eric, so I'd love to hear it, because it sounds like you disagree with that, so I'd love to kind of clarify where we're agreeing or disagreeing here.
Yeah, I would probably say I disagree with that. I think that if you look at a single marker, like, you know, unions are there to protect jobs. Well, yeah, what they're really there for is to protect fairness and objectivity. The reason that things like tenure, or I should say due process, because K-12 teachers don't have tenure, that's a uniquely higher ed thing. They have due process and permanent status, at least in some states, in California one, is because of the capricious nature of teachers being fired, of women being fired because they got married, or because they got, you know, they got pregnant, or because the administrator had a buddy who needed a job, or things like that. What teachers want and what our members want is their union to create a system that's fair and objective. They want to be held accountable, but they would want to be held accountable in a fair, objective way that really talks about improving their instructional practice so they can do their job better.
So actually, so one of the things you said, which is just, you know, you said, look, evaluation and peer assistance ought to be not a gotcha about improving instructional practice. And you said, look, at the end of the day, if you've done all of that, there are some teachers who probably should be counseled out. And it strikes me that when we, you know, you said, look, there seems to be a reform wing out there that says we're going to fire people, and that's kind of what reform is about. But it strikes me when I'm in rooms with those guys, they say, look, we've got to get serious about pushing out bad practitioners, but of course we want to improve everybody, of course. So I guess I'm curious, at what point on the continuum is the disagreement really happening? Because it sounds like both the CTA stance and even, hell, the student first stance is that you want to coach people up and you want them to get better, and at some point you've got to pull the plug on when people are not serving kids well. Where are those bright line differences?
Well, you know, when we talk about what some who would call themselves reformers and really using to impose what's more like a corporate model of teacher evaluation, tying unreliable and like, you know, these value-added measure scores or things like that to teachings, and trying to get just kind of get a number so they can lop off the bottom 10%, and then suddenly we'll all get better, and then they're going to take the next 10% and lop off the bottom and keep going until there's not a bottom 10% anymore. And that was a joke. I know there's always going to be a bottom 10%. But instead of looking, and what we know is that when teachers collaborate, QEIA has shown this, I think there's a lot of work around social capital and professional capital that says that when teachers work together and when they plan together and when they help each other get better and create a climate that is free from fear and intimidation and free from the gotcha and focuses on student achievement and focuses on improving their practice, that it lifts kind of all the teachers in that practice. There are 400,000 teachers in California. Do you think there may be one that may not be right for the profession? Probably, but it's not about getting that one or identifying them with a measure that's not an appropriate measure or finding the right number about getting them. It's about improving and focusing on everybody else so we can raise that.
So, Catherine, I mean, it strikes me that one of the points you made is that the same contract provisions, which provide protections and due process, depending on how you look at them, are also the risk provisions that get blamed for making it difficult to address people who are not serving kids well. How does one kind of disentangle then kind of the political piece that you're talking about from the professional piece of this, empirically even?
I think, so actually when Terry was talking, when everyone was talking, I was thinking how difficult it is to disentangle the two from each other. So I don't know how one says, well, this is a provision that solely is intended or acts as something that constrains the discretion versus something that protects teachers. And I don't know that we can say that. Nothing we can do can actually, I don't think, disentangle it at this point. What I do think is interesting, though, is that our work in LA has talked a lot. So I'm going to move back from evaluations for a second to something else, which has been talked about. Our interviews with teachers union people in LA and people from the district in LA, they are very clear that jobs are key to them. Of course, jobs are key. This is a labor union, and they want to protect the jobs of their members. But they're doing more than that. So they're not just trying to protect the jobs of their members, but they're trying to make their members' jobs better. And they're trying to make the schools that their members are in better in many ways. And so we think about LA as being very controversial and very antagonistic. But even in that situation, we see the union acting in the ways that we might say they're protecting the jobs, but also in ways that are more about being a professional association and working with teachers. And so I don't think it's easy to even disentangle those levels of the union.
So, Catherine, Terry laid on the table the notion that, unions are going to represent the job interests of their members, which means that, to Terry's point, collaboration is always going to give you half a loaf. Susan suggested that the only way you're going to get really transformative, sustained changes in teaching practice is through collaboration. Given the way you're looking at it, where do you come down on that split?
Thanks, Rick. I appreciate that. I think what I've seen in the work that I've done, and then especially in the most recent work in LA, I think that collaboration is necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient. So you can collaborate a lot and come up with something that's still half a loaf. You can not collaborate at all and come up with something that's maybe a little better than half a loaf. But if you don't include the union in the reform, right now the unions still are the voice of the teachers, and I don't think that we haven't seen in LA that it's going to be productive. And I think that the teacher evaluation system in LA that we're seeing happen right now is an example of that. I think we see things happening in all the reforms in LA that are an example of what happens when the union does not collaborate with the district and vice versa.
Wow, that was totally face the nation. Kind
Oh, good.
of. So I still don't. So
You still know what I'm talking about.
Still not sure. It's okay though. But you're not tenured yet. Good to play these things carefully.
We're not going to dinner again next time.
Richard, so one of the criticisms that sometimes gets voiced of collaboration is that what happens is boards and district administrators want to avoid creating too much turbulence. It's bad professionally. It's bad in terms of public support for the system. So what the unions and the administration can agree on is that taxpayers ought to pony up more, because then we can use those dollars to do good things without having to make hard choices. Curious, how do you think through that kind of critique of collaboration?
Interesting premise. What I would say is that this is my 24th year in education, and I wish just one of those years we would have had more resources than what we needed. We've never had the resources that we need. And I think part of that is because we view education as an expense, not an investment. And I want you to think about this, because this goes directly to this whole question around outcomes. I think that it's disingenuous for us to frame the conversation absent a conversation on outcomes, student-based outcomes, if we're talking about more of an investment from the public in public education. We just cannot have that conversation and say outcomes don't matter. But similarly, when you go to see your doctor, the first thing you don't ask your doctor is, how many malpractice suits have you had? Well, you might ask that. It's probably not the best way to develop a relationship. So you're probably going into that relationship with a very different lens. And I think that part of what we get sucked into, hook, line, and sinker, the unions, the districts, all the time is this false argument about Unions don't want to be invested in student-level outcomes, and districts don't want to hold teachers accountable. It's a false argument that doesn't really exist. Now, is it a difficult conversation to have? Absolutely, it's difficult. We just finished in a teacher dismissal case, which not one person would want their child in this teacher's classroom. We spent close to $275,000 to dismiss that teacher. Should that ever have happened? No. So if the middle ground could have been at some point with all due process being observed to say, look, this is just so simple, even a superintendent can understand it, right? This should not go any further. Then we could, I think those are the types of stories that don't do us, the collective us, any good. So I don't think that there's this, I think we're too quick to draw the lines of demarcation, and then, you know, we kind of dig the ditch and we start lobbing the mortars over at each other. Just don't want to be part of that.
Susan, yes. One of I feel like we're on The View.
Yes, right. I don't have time for TV, so I don't even know really what that means.
If you're in Washington, you watch lots of TV. This is what we do. It sounds like, from the examples you offer here, that you're making the case that there are instances of powerful collaboration where you're arguing that the interests of teachers and the unions align with those who are running better schools. Are there cases where those do not? Sure. What are indicators that they don't, and what do you do when they don't?
Sure there are, and I think I said that really at the beginning, that it can be a process that leads to, paralysis. But I just kind of starting with Terry's point about what social science is about, and it's the pursuit of looking for central tendencies. I just fundamentally disagree that that's all this is about. And that part of what our contribution is to the society is to say we have a process, it operates in different environments and has different consequences, and we're going to investigate what are the influences that affect that. So I could list the failures. I think fundamentally, because collective bargaining is set up as an adversarial process, and it's in the law, it's in the National Labor Relations Act and in the state collective bargaining laws, it's kind of set up to say we're going to disagree. And so places that have used this process to fashion really different ways of approaching these really difficult problems are adopting a whole different way of doing things. And I don't think, this is why I say I don't think these are rare birds. I think that, in fact, there is a lot of this going on. If it were just the unions, and I hate to go back to an argument that's made often, if it were just the unions and collective bargaining that's the problem, South Carolina would look much better. There have not been teacher dismissals in many states, in states across the country, so bargaining or non-bargaining. This is a process that in the past hasn't worked. And the procedures have been there in many places. And for a variety of very interesting reasons, people have not been dismissed. Ineffective teachers have not been dismissed. So I think it's just insufficient to say that is the union's doing. And if we look across all the districts, we will see overall paralysis, because it's just not the case. And I think we just have to know much more as researchers about the complexity of it.
So if we were to even just think about the tail at the other end, from the New Havens and the Baltimores, how do you make?
What does it look like?
What does that look like? But also, what would you counsel? What does one do if one's in those situations where collaboration is not a fruitful avenue?
Well, I mean, I have tried to mediate in situations that I felt were hopeless, and I can tell you what was going on was a kind of ignorant clash of positions. Administrators who actually didn't have any respect for teachers as well as for unions, and unions that really thought administrators were out to get teachers. And that when that's the position, and when you're sort of in a process that's about combat and splitting the difference between bad options, it doesn't lead to productive work. I mean, and I don't need to provide examples because there are lots of them. But I think we're really moving in many places beyond that. And I think it's worth investing in that.
Terry, you've got that look. Thoughts?
Look, I think teachers' unions care about achievement, and I think that their members care about kids. You know, that's not the source of the problem here. The problem is that teachers who are wonderful people join unions to protect their jobs. Right? Unions don't represent them in all aspects of their life. They join unions to protect their jobs, and that's what unions do. And so, yeah, I mean, the people sitting around the table can say, we care about student achievement. And they do. Right? They want to improve the schools. But then if you say, okay, are you willing to do away with seniority-based layoffs? No. Are you willing to do away with seniority-based transfers? No. All right. So they're willing to make steps to improve student achievement, but fundamental things that could improve the effective organization of schools, they're unwilling to do. And the reason for this is that there's a basic conflict of interest at work here, and the process is ultimately about power. And so I think, you know, a lot of people want to think that if you just get well-intentioned people in a room, they can work their way toward some kind of optimal solution where everybody's happy and we can have effective schools. That's not in the cards here. And I think if people look at it that way, they're misunderstanding what's really happening. This is about power and it's about interests, and there are fundamental reasons why we're having a problem reforming the schools.
So let me just respond to that. If your answer to school reform is getting rid of seniority, then yes, the union will say no. Because the union says no to bad ideas. Eliminating seniority does nothing to increase student achievement. And in fact, that's just limiting the conversation in a way that sets up a false dichotomy between this and, you know, this and this. If you want to talk about a real school transformation, and you want to partner with the union in a way that involves them in a true parity with the district, it's happening all over California, and and just also I need to say that in California, unions
Eric,
don't.
Are you saying that as part of a more holistic plan, that your view towards eliminating seniority would be different?
I would say it depends on if you have. I don't say. I think it's not really a question of seniority or no seniority. That's just limiting the conversation.
No,
it's got to be holistic. It's got to be an overall approach, and you can see it. You can have seniority. Seniority is there for a reason. It's there to protect the teachers from discriminatory firing. It's there to find an objective way of not laying off teachers just because you want to bring in the so-called new blood or whatever. That's not what seniority. I mean, that's what seniority is about.
But I think Terry's point is I think Terry was arguing that there are times when seniority is going to be inconsistent with the personnel decisions that might be in the best interest of the organization. And I guess the question was, are there holistic reform scenarios where your view towards defending seniority is different than if it's just a referendum on seniority?
The way I would talk about seniority might be different. But if you're using seniority merely as a way to fire teachers that you think you don't like, and you don't want to go through a real evaluation process that talks about it, and evaluating them in a fair and objective way, and provide them with the kind of resources they need to improve, and provide them with peer assistance and peer review and the whole. If you're not willing to do that, and you just want to use getting rid of seniority as a cheap way or a lazy way to get rid of the so-called bad teachers, or teachers that cost more money, which is another reason why you need to actually have seniority. Then yeah, we change the way I would talk about it. But it's really about creating an evaluation system. Seniority and getting rid of teachers are really two different questions.
Let's go ahead and open it up. If folks have questions, we've got mics here. Again, I would just ask that you be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation. And please make sure that you're asking a question. If we get 10, 15 seconds in, I don't see it, we'll just give somebody else a shot. Yes, sir.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Alex Hoffman. I'm a graduate student at Teachers College, and I'm the president of Validative Consulting. This is for Terry. I entirely agree that theory-driven is critical. We've got to be building theory, improving theory, challenging theory, but theory has to be falsifiable. How much discrepant evidence do you need to accept that your simplistic model of union motivation just isn't accurate?
Well,
All right, how about if we don't boo or cheer questions? Let's just have a conversation.
I think it's easily falsifiable, right? I mean, if unions were out there saying, seniority-based layoffs really do seem to be inconsistent with effective organization. A lot of fantastic junior teachers are being fired, right? Whereas there are many senior teachers who ought to be let go before them based on performance considerations. There's also empirical studies to show that this leads to a less effective workforce, right? So why don't unions stand up and say, okay, we'll just give up those rules. If they did that all across the country and said, man, this was just a bad idea, this is not good for effective organization, I would begin to say, this is inconsistent with my theory. Right down the line, there are all kinds of implications.
So are you saying that the discrepant evidence does not yet exist?
I think that, first of all, there's not enough research to determine all these things, but in my view, there are cases out there at the margins, like New Haven. I mentioned New Haven, right? I think that there are cases that make me think, okay, why is it that the union is doing what it's doing in New Haven? Because this simple model that I have doesn't seem to capture what they're doing. That's an interesting thing. It's important for the development of the field and for the modification of theories over time that you try to adjust theories to take those things into account. But my view, and I've set it out in my book, which is 500 pages long, there's a lot of evidence in there, is that this simple theory is generally consistent with the facts. And what I would like is for there to be a real social science with a lot of people in it where people would come and say, look, here's an alternative theory that's better than your theory. Here's the evidence that shows that your theory is wrong and that this theory is better. That's what we need.
Okay. Yes, sir.
My name is Sachin Maharaj. I'm a student at the University of Toronto. Coming from Canada, I tend to look at issues like teacher unions, I think, from a more international perspective. My question is also for Terry. First off, I want to say I admire your courage in presenting your views here. But when we look at sort of the international evidence, like performance on PISA, for example, almost all of the high-performing countries have strong teacher unions. So if you look at Finland, South Korea, and even Canada, where I come from. So I guess my question is, well, it doesn't seem like having strong teacher unions is necessarily antithetical to having an effective education system. So what do you think it is about the American context, perhaps, where this may not be the case?
No, that's a very interesting thing. I think, we ought to have a lot of research on the role of teachers' unions in different countries. We don't have that right now. There's just nothing out there. It's unbelievable, right? So the fact of the matter is, one, teachers' unions are not the only factor affecting student achievement. So you'd want to take into account all sorts of things about society and about the schools and also about the political system that they're in. Most of these countries have parliamentary systems which are very different from our system, right? They have collective bargaining arrangements that are much more centralized than ours. Ours is very decentralized, and it results in thick contracts filled with restrictive work rules. Well, that tends not to happen in these other countries, right? And so the role that unions play in these other countries is different. But it's different in ways that we don't yet really understand. We should understand those things.
Okay, next.
Hi, Eric Laram from Students First. Rick, first of all, I wanted to answer your earlier question. I don't think you got a clear answer. The distinction between Students First and where unions are on an issue, for instance, like evaluations, when you line up the elements of what goes into an evaluation system, we line up almost exactly on all of the elements except when you get down to the amount of weighting that should be applied to student growth. And there's anywhere from like a 10 to 25% difference. Where the real distinction comes in is how those evaluations, how that information should be used, whether or not administrators in districts should be able to use that information to drive personnel decisions, and whether or not parents should have a right to have access to whether or not their teachers are able to meet their students' needs. I had a question for Catherine quickly on looking at the measures in collective bargaining agreements and criteria such as improving working conditions. I was wondering if you were able to draw out any distinctions in looking at that and dividing it in terms of the type of teacher, the years of service that they've been in the profession. So for example, specifically wondering about something like improving working conditions, and you look at job security, whether that means that their job security that is flat for all teachers in the school, whether it's job security that is really job security for the most senior teachers in the school, or whether it's job security that would be for the highest performing teachers in the school. Because it seems to me if you were to poll teachers, you'd get a great variance in the value they attach to each of those.
That's interesting. So, no, I have not looked at it specifically like that. I do think that the issue of seniority, which is in some sense is job security, is interesting because we talk about contracts as if they're completely the same across the board, and every contract says that seniority dictates transfers and layoffs and everything else. In California, first of all, layoffs are off the table. That's a state-driven decision. But second of all, only fewer than 10% of contracts actually say seniority dictates transfers and assignment. Many of them say all else equal, which could mean that they can include things like teacher skills and special considerations, teacher subjects. And so in that sense, we are different than some states. I mean, Dan's in the audience and he looks at Washington, he can speak to it differently, but we are different than some states in that we don't require that seniority is the same across all the different contracts. And so in that sense, job security is very different in the different districts and we don't have the data in California to look at what that means by teachers because we don't have the linked data at this point. But it's a great question.
Okay. I'm Rosalinda Quintanar, and I'm a professor at San Jose State University. And I think whoever wants to answer the question, I think that looking at seniority, yes, I think that's a very narrow way of just looking at what unions are. And for me, usually the teachers are the union, and sometimes the parents feel like they're the union. And I was wondering if you have looked at more about, like, for example, the professional development that has been done by the unions. Because a lot of times people that don't even belong to the unions attend the conferences put on by the unions. And, and also, has anybody studied the way that the young, wonderful teachers are paired up with the seniority, with the older teachers, and how much they learn from each other? So have you looked at that, Catherine, in the way of the environment and the professional development that occurs?
Great, thank you.
So Susan has done much more of that work, and it's too bad that she's not here to answer that question. Some of the work that I'm just going to do with colleagues in Los Angeles who are here today has to do with the role that they have been playing in the different reforms, part of which has been professional development in the midst of these reforms. That's an incredibly important role for unions to play. I don't have any data to tell me whether or not that exists across all districts in California or all districts across the state, but I think it's, as Terry said, there's room for that research, and I would like to see much more systematic research that does show the different roles that unions can play, and that is an important one.
Eric, do you guys have internal metrics where you track extent of that, amount of it, folks who participate and don't participate in those kinds of union CTA offered opportunities?
Well, we do. We don't because we don't have the capability or the capacity to reach all the teachers in the state, and a lot of our professional development is done at the local level with our local staff and with local teachers. And doing so, we do have statewide conferences and the like on different.
But you don't have that kind of data somewhere at the CTA offices tracking that.
No, because it happens in so many different ways, and there's just no way to track that data centrally.
Gotcha. No, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Michael Hartney, I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Notre Dame. My question goes to what Terry was talking about earlier when he was calling for a robust research literature on this question. So my advice from my advisor was don't study the teachers' unions. The Freedom of Information Act request will become your best friend. I'm hoping to create my own eHarmony moment here, which is to ask, can we get some agreement on the panel with opening up data? Because I would like the researchers to address the question of how difficult have you found it, what pieces of data are difficult to come by in studying the unions, and those on the practitioner side, what data are you willing to allow researchers to get their hands on? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start off. Anyways, I've been studying the teachers' unions for over 10 years, and it's a basic nightmare. I mean, we have a hard enough time getting data on other things, right? But getting it on the teachers' union is pretty difficult. But the NEA was good, in providing. I wanted membership data for every district in the country. How many members do you have in these districts? This is just objective information. You think they would say, okay. And the NEA did. And they sent me like a CD with all the data. But good for them, But actually, I think they're proud of their membership, right? Because they're huge and they're everywhere. Okay, so I asked the AFT for that information. And they said no. And I think part of the reason is only about half their members are teachers. And a big percentage of them are concentrated in New York State. I don't think they want people to know this. This is my personal view. So as a result, they don't give out that information, or at least they weren't when I was asking for it. And so then I thought, well, okay, I'll ask the states, right? So I asked the state organizations individually to get the data, and a couple of them were forthcoming and gave me the data. And then later I found out that the headquarters had put out the word to all the state affiliates, don't talk to this guy. Don't give him any information. And I eventually wound up talking to a guy who was like a tough guy on the phone. He was doing the tough guy thing. He was, I don't know, he was like a vice president or something like that. And he basically said, look, man, we're not giving you anything. Only it was a gruffer, tougher voice than I have, right? It was quite an experience. So anyway, I didn't get any information from them, and I had to scrounge around and get my information. And this is just information on how many members they have. So imagine trying to get more detailed information about them. My view is that given the integral role they play in the whole public education system, I think the national government should be requiring that all districts send in their collective bargaining contracts. And they should provide information on which union represents their workers, how many workers belong to unions. It should just be public information.
Catherine, how hard is it to get your hands on the collective bargaining agreements and do the work that you're doing?
I feel very sorry for my RAs. So collecting collective bargaining agreements has been really difficult, but it's not just from the union side, it's from the district side. They don't all post them on their website. We then have to do public information requests asked, oftentimes multiple times. This takes a lot of effort to collect collective bargaining agreements. It's not easily accessible, and I think it should be from both the union and the district side. I have had a different experience working with the CTA when I wanted to do a survey, and I had assistance from the CTA to go out to all of their members with the survey. Response rates were quite low, but they often are when you survey teachers individually. But the CTA was willing to work with me to get that data and work with me on the survey itself. So that was a different experience.
Fellas, curious your perspective.
Yeah, we're open. So we actually quite readily provide our information to researchers. I would give you the name of Heather Hoff from Stanford University, or was with Stanford University, who has done several case studies. I think it was even her dissertation on the Quality Teacher Education Act, the parcel tax that I referenced, that has professional development, that has the PAR. She did quite an extensive case study on that, and that's chock full of information, not only on recruitment, but retention, promotion, career lattice, if you will. We don't actually call that career lattice in our district, but similar type of efforts in our district. And also the retention rates of our teachers. So yeah, we're an open book, and you don't even need to file a public information act.
Eric?
I think most unions, like NEA, function under the Landrum-Griffith Act, which requires a certain level of transparency under in terms of function and who's working there and who the membership and so on, and that's easy information to get. I think it's all posted online at the Department of Labor. CTA has worked with many researchers around things. I don't know who the gruff talking vice president was, but I don't have a gruff voice, so it wasn't me. But we're not as forthcoming when it's for our opposition, so to speak, would that want to use the information to do us harm. I guess that's the best way to put it.
All right. And we got time for one more. Dan, this is any last question?
It's a lot of pressure, closing question. All right.
Yeah,
so,
try not to bore us.
Yeah, I'll try. That's a tall order for me. So Richard, you a couple times mentioned targeted professional development. And, I'm sure there are folks that disagree, but my read on the literature is that while professional development may work in some cases, generally the evidence about the efficacy of professional development investments is not all that promising. And one argument for that might be that it's often not targeted, and it's not targeted because there's not very good information on individual teacher performance such that it can be targeted. So this kind of comes back to one of the things that Terry raised earlier. So my question to you is, forgetting the bottom, if you take the 95, 90%, whatever percentage of the distribution you think you want to keep in the workforce, how much differentiation is there in the teacher evaluations beyond just, yes, there is differentiation, but in kind of hard numbers, how much differentiation is there in San Francisco?
There's a ton of differentiation. I would say that part of the conversation that becomes quite honestly frustrating for the practitioner is that we're talking about teacher unions here, but we haven't even talked about the policymakers. You haven't talked about state lawmakers. You haven't talked about state law. There was a nutty proposal last legislative session where we were going to have to bargain what the actual artifacts were for an evaluation. Can you imagine that? You're gonna bargain that? So then how, all I know, and I'm just a teacher, and I say that proudly, but I know this, that if I go to a school in one part of my city, third graders are getting a much different education from third graders in another part of the city. And if I have to bargain what is required amongst different parts, different districts, I mean, there's a legislative policy-making role that's very important here as well. So I know it's a long way around to answering your question. There's a lot of differentiation, and I would say that that's part of the problem.
We're gonna.
Right. So part of the beyond is that we quite don't know, right? How do you measure that?
Okay, here we go. We just birthed the project. It's gonna be beautiful.
Perfect.
Hey, I want to apologize to the questioners who we didn't get a chance to, but the panelists, I think we had to grab them for a couple minutes. I'd like to thank you guys for being a terrific and engaged audience. I'd like to thank the panelists and Susan who had to leave us for a terrific and lively conversation. Have a great afternoon.